Open a map of Southeast Asia, and you see one of the most broken up places on Earth. Thousands of islands: Sumatra, Borneo, Java, the Malay Peninsula, the Philippines, scattered across a warm blue sea like pieces of a shattered plate. Narrow straits, shallow water. It looks like a place that has always been fragments. It hasn't. 20,000 years ago, if you had stood on the coast of what is now Vietnam and walked south, you would not have hit the sea. You would have walked onto a vast, flat, tropical plain and kept walking, past great rivers wider than the Amazon, through forests and open grassland, past herds of elephants and deer, past tigers and rhinos. You could have walked all the way to Borneo, all the way to Java, without once getting your feet wet, because there was no sea between them. It was all one land. It was a continent. Some estimates put it, at its greatest extent, at around 4 million square kilometers, roughly the size of the modern European Union. It had rivers, coasts, mountains, forests. It had animals found nowhere else, and it had people. For tens of thousands of years, people lived on it, hunted on it, and buried their dead on it. Try to hold that scale for a second, because the numbers slide off the mind. 4 million square kilometers is not an island that sank. It is not a coastline that retreated. It is a continent. Bigger than India, roughly the size of the entire European Union, that existed above water, with rivers and forests and living things and human beings on it. And that is now, in its entirety, underneath the sea. Not a piece of it, all of it. Everything I am about to describe, every plain and river and hunting ground, you would today have to put on a boat and dive to reach. Scientists call this lost continent Sundaland. And here's the part that ties this whole story together. On the very eastern edge of Sundaland, right at its coastline, is where our very first video began. The people who crossed the ocean to Australia 65,000 years ago set off from the shore of this continent. Sundaland was the launch pad. It was the edge of the known world, and beyond it lay the open water they somehow crossed. We have already told the story of where they went. This is the story of where they came from, and of what happened to that homeland after they left. Because Sundaland is not on any map today. Every part of it that I just described, the plains, the rivers, the forests, the coasts where people lived, is now at the bottom of the sea. This is the story of the continent that drowned and took the beginning of a world down with it. To see Sundaland, you have to do what we've done before in these stories. You have to lower the sea. During the last ice age, at its coldest point around 21,000 years ago, an enormous amount of the world's water was locked up in the great ice sheets covering the northern continents. So much water was taken out of the oceans that the global sea level dropped by roughly 120 meters. 120 meters lower than today. Now, whether that matters depends entirely on the shape of the seafloor. Off a steep coast, dropping the sea 100 meters barely changes the map. But Southeast Asia sits on something special. The Sunda Shelf, one of the largest stretches of shallow continental shelf anywhere on Earth. The water over most of it is shallow, often less than 100 meters deep. So when the Ice Age pulled the sea down, this entire enormous shelf came up out of the water and became dry land. And not a little of it. The shallow seas you see today between Malaysia, Sumatra, Borneo, and Java, the Java Sea, the shallow parts of the South China Sea, all of that became solid ground. The islands stopped being islands. They joined together and joined to the mainland into one continuous tropical continent stretching from Thailand down to Bali.
We are not guessing at this. The evidence is written into the seafloor itself.
If you map the bottom of the Java Sea and the South China Sea, you find things that cannot form underwater.
I know, the mammoths are
You find ancient river channels, the winding beds of great rivers carved across what is now sea bottom. Geologists have traced entire drowned river systems down there, with names like the North Sunda River and the Mullengraf River, gathering the waters of a whole continent and carrying them out to a coastline that no longer exists. You find old floodplains, old deltas, the unmistakable fingerprints of a landscape that was, without any doubt, once dry, open, walkable land. So what was it like to stand there? Here we hit a genuine and interesting scientific argument, and it's worth being honest about it. For a long time, the assumption was that Ice Age Sundaland was covered in the same thick tropical rainforest you see in Borneo today.
But the climate then was cooler and drier than now, and some researchers argued that instead of solid jungle, there was a savanna corridor, open grassland running through the continent, easy to walk across, full of grazing animals. Others pushed back. A study in 2023 argued for a forest mosaic rather than open savanna, a patchwork of woodland and clearings. Another in 2024 leaned back toward expanding grasslands driven by shifts in the seasonal rains. We don't have to settle it to get the picture. Whether it was open savanna or a patchwork of forest and grassland, one thing is clear. It was not the dense, closed rainforest of today. It was more open, more walkable, easier to live on and move across. A place a person could travel through, following the game and the rivers, across a continent that no longer exists. And whichever it was teeming. This was the tropics, warm and wet enough to be green, cool and open enough to move through.
You shouldn't have come
Some
back.
of the most productive land for a hunter-gatherer that has ever existed. There were elephants, and an extinct relative of them. There were rhinos, tigers, wild cattle, deer, pigs, monkeys. There were rivers full of fish and estuaries full of shellfish. For a people who lived by hunting and gathering, Sundaland was not a hard place to survive. It was close to the opposite. A broad, rich, generous continent. And there is every reason to think a great many people lived on it, spread across the plains that are now sea. People had been living in this region for an almost unimaginable stretch of time, long before our own species even existed. More than 1 million years ago, an earlier kind of human, Homo erectus, was already living on what is now the island of Java. We know them from their fossils and from the famous discovery once called Java Man. 1 million years ago, Java was not an island. It was part of the mainland of Sundaland, and these ancient humans could walk there across dry ground following the herds. They lived in this region in various forms for an enormous span of time. Let that sink in. 1 million years. Our own species, Homo sapiens, has existed for perhaps 300,000 years, and these earlier humans were living on Sundaland more than 3 times longer ago than that. When you stand on Java today and look at the sea, you are standing on ground that has been home to one kind of human or another for longer than we have been a species at all. It is one of the deepest continuous records of human life anywhere on the planet, and most of the land it played out on is now underwater. And then, much later, came us. Modern humans, Homo sapiens, our own species, reached Sundaland somewhere around 70 to 50,000 years ago, spreading east along the southern coast of Asia.
And when they got here, they walked out onto that same great continent. This is the population we met in our very first story, the people who, from the eastern edge of Sundaland, looked out at open ocean and crossed it to reach Australia. But most of them didn't cross. Most of them stayed and lived and spread across the drowned continent, whose shape we can now only trace from the seafloor. And remarkably, we can still find their descendants today. Scattered across Southeast Asia, in the Andaman Islands, in the deep forests of the Malay Peninsula, in the Philippines, there are indigenous peoples, sometimes grouped under the old term negrito. Groups like the Andamanese, the Aeta, the Samang. And when scientists study their DNA, they find something striking. These groups are among the most deeply divergent human populations in all of Asia. Their ancestry branches off very early. Some analyses suggest their lineage split off tens of thousands of years ago and then stayed remarkably isolated ever since. Researchers have called them, in a real sense, the descendants of the first Sundaland people, living genetic threads running back to the original inhabitants of the drowned continent. And there is an even older ghost tangled up in their DNA. Like the people of Australia and New Guinea, some of these groups carry fragments of Denisovan ancestry, genes from an archaic human species, cousins of the Neanderthals that our ancestors met and mixed with somewhere in this part of the world tens of thousands of years ago. The Philippine Negritos, in particular, carry some of the highest levels of Denisovan ancestry found anywhere, which means that on Sundaland, or its edges, modern humans encountered another kind of human. And that meeting is still written in the blood of people living today. So this was not an empty continent. It was a deeply, anciently inhabited one, home to some of the oldest continuous human presence anywhere outside Africa. And all of it, every camp and every trail and every burial on the lowland plains, was living on borrowed time, because the ice was already beginning to melt. Around 19 to 18,000 years ago, the Great Ice Age ice sheets began to break down, and as they melted, all that water flooded back into the oceans, and the sea began to rise. And Sundaland, like Doggerland on the other side of the world, was uniquely doomed, for exactly the same reason. It was flat. We've seen this before, but it bears repeating, because it is the engine of the whole tragedy. On a steep coast, a rising sea climbs the slope and eats only a thin strip of land. But on a flat shelf like Sundaland, every single meter of sea level rise doesn't eat a strip, it swallows kilometers. The water doesn't climb, it spreads. And the Sunda shelf was about as flat as land gets. So as the sea came up, the coastline didn't creep, it raced inland. On that flat ground, a modest rise in the sea could push the shore back by kilometers in a lifetime. Land that had been solid for tens of thousands of years turned to coast, then to shallow sea, then was gone. And it didn't happen at a steady pace. The melting came in surges. The most dramatic is known as meltwater pulse 1A, around 14,500 years ago, a period when the collapse of distant ice sheets sent the global sea level surging upward extraordinarily fast, by something like 18 meters in just 4 to 5 centuries. On the flat plains of Sundaland, a pulse like that was catastrophic. The sea would have advanced not over generations, but visibly, within a human lifetime, the shoreline moving year after year, swallowing the lowlands, drowning the river valleys where people lived. Think about what that meant on the ground. The rivers we talked about, the great drowned channels on the sea floor today, those were where people lived. Rivers are where you find fresh water, fish, fertile soil. The lowland river valleys would have been the most densely populated, most desirable land on the whole continent. And the lowlands are exactly what drowns first. The best land, the most lived-on land, went under first and fastest. So the people were pushed off the drowning plains, up onto the higher ground, the ground that is still above water today, the ground we now call Sumatra and Borneo and Java. As the sea rose, the one continent broke apart into the islands we see now, and the people were divided along with it, stranded on separating fragments of what had been their home.
Populations that had been connected for tens of thousands of years were suddenly cut off from each other by water, which is exactly why we see that deep isolation in the DNA today. The sea didn't just take their land.
It carved their family tree apart. And this is not a metaphor. It is measurable. When geneticists study those isolated groups today, they can see the marks of small populations cut off and left alone for a very long time. High levels of shared ancestry, low diversity, the genetic signature of communities that were separated from their neighbors and stayed separated for millennia. The rising sea didn't only rearrange the map. It reached into the human population itself, took a single connected people and snipped it into isolated pieces on separate islands. And those pieces drifted apart genetically, the way islands drift apart on a map, until they became the distinct peoples we find today. You can read the drowning of Sundaland in living human blood. By around 5 to 5,500 years ago, it was over. The sea reached roughly its present level. The continent was gone. Where there had been one great tropical land, there was now a scatter of islands and a warm, shallow sea. The map we know today, drawn by drowning. Let me show you two things that make this real. Two pieces of the drowned continent you can still, in a sense, see. The first is the rivers. When geologists mapped the floor of the Sunda Shelf, they didn't just find vague evidence of old land. They found the actual drainage system of the continent, the tree of rivers that had watered it. There was a huge river system, sometimes called the North Sunda or Mullengraff River, that ran up through what is now the South China Sea, gathering tributaries from western Borneo and eastern Sumatra, draining an enormous basin. A river system on the scale of the great rivers of the world, running across ground that is now under 50 meters of sea. When you look at a map of those reconstructed rivers, you are looking at the veins of a dead continent. They are still down there, buried in silt, tracing the shape of a land that no map remembers. Picture standing on the bank of that river when it still ran. A river as wide as any great river on Earth, moving slowly through open woodland under a tropical sun, full of fish, lined with the camps of people who drank from it and fished it and knew every bend of it. That river is still there. It has not moved. It is simply 50 meters underwater now, choked with sediment, dark and silent, with container ships passing overhead where the people once stood. Nothing dramatic marks it. It is just a shape in the mud, holding the memory of a continent. The second thing is a line. Sail east across the drowned continent, and at a certain point, between the islands of Bali and Lombok, and running up through the strait between Borneo and Sulawesi, something strange happens. The animals change. On the western side, you get the animals of Asia: tigers, elephants, rhinos, monkeys. On the eastern side, suddenly, you don't. You get a completely different world. Marsupials, cockatoos, the animals related to those of Australia and New Guinea. This boundary is called the Wallace Line, named for the naturalist Alfred Russel Wallace, the same man we met in the Australia story, who noticed this exact divide in the 1850s. And here is why it exists. That line marks the eastern edge of Sundaland. West of it was the connected continent, where Asian animals could simply walk from place to place. But east of it, even at the lowest sea levels, there was always deep water, a channel too deep to ever dry out, no matter how much the sea fell. The animals of Asia walked freely across Sundaland right up to that edge, and then stopped, because the land stopped. The Wallace Line is the drowned coastline of the lost continent, still visible today, written in the distribution of living animals. Think about how strange and wonderful that is. A boundary you cannot see, in the open sea, that animals will not cross. Not because anything stops them in the water, but because of where a coastline sat tens of thousands of years ago on a continent that no longer exists. The tigers of Bali and the marsupials of Lombok are separated by a strip of water a bird could fly across in minutes. But their ancestors were separated by that deep channel at the edge of Sundaland, and that separation is held for so long that the two islands, side by side, belong to two completely different animal worlds. The lost continent drew a line, and the living world still obeys it. And that same deep water edge, the thing that stopped the tigers and elephants, is exactly the barrier that the first people to reach Australia had to cross by sea. The eastern shore of Sundaland was the end of the walkable world. Beyond it was the open water of our first story. The launch pad and the barrier were the same coastline, the drowned edge of this drowned continent. Now, I have to be careful here because Sundaland attracts a particular kind of story, and I want to separate what is solid from what is not. Because it was a real drowned continent in a part of the world rich with old traditions, Sundaland has been seized on by people looking for a real Atlantis. The idea that a lost, advanced civilization with cities and technology sank beneath the Java Sea, and that this is the source of every flood myth and lost paradise legend on Earth. You will find whole books and websites devoted to this. Let me be plain. There is no scientific evidence for a lost, advanced civilization on Sundaland. None. The people who lived there were hunter-gatherers and, later, early farmers, sophisticated, capable, deeply adapted to their world, but not builders of sunken cities. When you see Sundaland attached to claims about Atlantis or advanced ancient technology, you have left the science behind. I'm not going to sell you that because it isn't true, and this channel does not deal in things that aren't true. But here is what is true, and it is remarkable enough on its own. A real continent, larger than most, really did drown within the span of human history while people lived on it. Real populations really were pushed off the land and divided by the rising sea, and we can still read that event in their genes today. And this was one of the largest, most rapid drownings of inhabited land anywhere on the planet. An event on a scale that, if it happened today, would be one of the great catastrophes in human history. Could a memory of it have survived? Southeast Asia is full of flood traditions and stories of lost land, just as we found around the Black Sea. And just as with the Black Sea, the honest answer is, we can't prove any specific myth is a memory of the drowning of Sundaland. Flood stories are everywhere because water and people have always lived together. But the drowning itself is not a myth. It is a documented geological and human fact, and the people it happened to didn't need to write it down for it to be real. It's written in the seafloor, in the rivers under the silt, in the line the animals still won't cross, and in the DNA of the people who got away. So put the whole thing together, and put it next to where we started. Our first story was about a handful of people on a beach at the edge of the known world who did something almost impossible. They crossed open ocean to a new continent 65,000 years ago. We told that story looking forward. Where did they go? How did they survive the crossing? What did they become? This is the same beach, seen from the other side. That beach was the eastern shore of a whole continent. Behind those voyagers, stretching away to the west, was Sundaland. 4 million square kilometers of tropical land, rivers, forests, and tens of thousands of years of human life. They were not leaving a small island. They were leaving the edge of a world. And then that world sank. Slowly, over thousands of years, the sea that they had crossed rose up and took the land they had left behind.
The plains went under. The great rivers were buried in silt. The one continent broke into the islands on the map today, and the people who stayed were scattered onto the fragments, divided by water, isolated for so long that we can still see the separation in their blood. We think of Southeast Asia as a place that has always been islands. It hasn't. It's the drowned coastline of a continent, the high ground of a sunken world, with the peaks still showing above the water. Every island there is a mountaintop of Sundaland. The sea between them is the grave of the plains. The people crossed the ocean and found a new world, and behind them, quietly, over the generations, the old ones slipped beneath the waves, until all that was left above water were the hills, which we call islands, and the memory, which we call myth, and the shape of a continent that only the seafloor still remembers.